Welcome back to Viewpoint. I'm Maya Berry. This week, police raided the Occupy Wall Street encampment in New York City and arrested close to 200 protesters, while camps in several other cities saw similar police actions. Where does the movement go from here? Joining us with his view is Zaid, senior reporter and blogger for thinkprogress.org and editor for the 99% movement at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. Zaid, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with where you think the movement is at today. I know it's a huge question, but I think as we're sort of reflecting on the anniversary of what started in New York is now spread across the country, where do you think these actions are today?
Well, I think it's really interesting because obviously we saw what Mayor Bloomberg did in New York City, what Mayor Kwan did in Oakland, and how mayors are trying to push these sort of sustained occupations out of their public spaces. And yet what we're seeing is that the movements are sort of adapting their strategies. They're focusing more on sit-ins in key locations, stopping foreclosures, protest marches, things that can keep the momentum going without necessarily having to be in a public space in a sustained 24/7 sort of way.
One of the things that's, for particularly our international viewers, that find fascinating about this is that in some ways it received its inspiration from what happened in the Arab Spring. And that was very much about young people and economic conditions that weren't meeting their needs. So that translates here in terms of what's been happening. But are there any unifying messages that are coming out of these different pockets of protests?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been to several, at least 3 different occupations in many different parts of the country. And I think the most unifying theme that I found here is actually one that I think people in the Arab world should be able to relate to, which is that the system isn't working for them. The economy isn't working for them. They're not able to get through school without massive amounts of debt. They're not able to find good jobs. They're not able to basically make good lives for their families. And I think not only was that the message that you saw in Tahrir, but that's the message you'll see in New York City or in Washington, D.C., which is that it's mostly young people out there in the streets, people who have the time and energy and passion to do it, but that they have a huge base of support among the middle classes of the countries also who are feeling the same sort of squeeze that they are.
One of the things I find fascinating about this contrast of the 99 to the 1%, it's now taken on a completely partisan tone. So that you have Illinois governor saying this is a good idea and we should be doing it. You have Karl Rove saying, who gave you the right to occupy America? I can't imagine that that's particularly helpful to this movement, which desires to be very broad-based. What's your sense of the sort of partisan perception of this?
Right, well, particularly in mainstream politics in America, it's very common to just make everything partisan, everything about Democrats versus Republicans, so on and so forth. But what's really fascinating to me is that if you actually talk to the people who are doing the demonstrating, who are planning the actions, they actually don't care about political party at all. They would care about the issue which they're demonstrating about, which is primarily about income inequality. And it's really fascinating. I've even tracked among Republican politicians, right-wing Republican politicians, are talking much more about income inequality now because I think they realize that this is a broad-based movement and that even though they or Democratic politicians want to make it about partisan politics, at the end of the day, it's a message that resonates far wider than just the sort of partisan political system in Washington.
Do you think that's working like for an average person who perhaps is not living in an urban center where there's an Occupy movement taking place, and I'm just watching it at home, and I'm just wondering about how you achieve change beyond the fact that there is a tremendous amount of media coverage that's taking place. That you cannot question. This is tremendously successful in that regard. But are the issues translating? Do you think that one, the issues people understand is there, and two, does it connect to them in some way?
I think more and more it's connecting, and more people are figuring out different ways to get involved. I mean, there was a really creative YouTube video that had like 500,000 views within a few days about a man simply explaining that you should take credit card mailers and send them back to the companies in protest because it actually costs money to the companies to get those mailers back, and it doesn't cost you anything. And thousands and thousands of Americans were doing that. There's other things like people write. There's a website called Occupy the Boardroom where Americans are actually writing to major executives at banks and sort of protesting bank policies in that way. We saw 650,000 Americans switch from major banks to credit unions. That's 12 times, more than 12 times actually, the number of Americans who switched in the entire year of 2010. So I think what we're seeing is that there are a lot of Americans who are not necessarily out in the streets. They have families to take care of. They can't be doing these protest actions, but they're finding other ways to protest economic inequality and try to make real change in the country, and that I think is the most heartening of all things.
That's a real, actually I didn't know that. See, this is one of the other things that I didn't know until, frankly, I started reading your blog and in preparation for having you on, is you've talked a lot about the underlying issues in terms of the economic situation. And you focused, I found something interesting we've got for our viewers on our screen, the financial corruption and the level to which prosecutions have dropped dramatically. When you're at these Occupy events, is this the kind of thing that comes up? I mean, is this the underlying part of what is why people are protesting?
Right. I mean, I'm trying to think who said it. It may have been Van Jones, the activist Van Jones, who said it. But it's not called, Occupy Silicon Valley. They're not necessarily protesting against wealthy people. It's good to have wealthy people in your country. They started on Wall Street because Wall Street is basically what caused the problem today. I mean, it was their financial fraud that led to the meltdown and recession, and they're the people who are responsible for what's happening all over the country right now. And I think that's why they're targeting them. And I think, when I go to these demonstrations, there are a lot of people who are very well educated about the problem and people who can actually rattle off their really specific set of grievances, and they primarily are based around what Wall Street financial institutions and some of the more corrupt, very wealthy who bought out our political system are doing to the country.
Is there a leadership to this movement, and what does it look like?
There is leadership in the sense of they do have some sort of formal power structures. They don't have individuals necessarily, like there isn't like an elected president of the 99% or anything. But pretty much every single one of the occupations has committees. They get together and they vote, or they use consensus models to sort of plan actions. And it's actually incredibly organized. If you go to one of these and you go through the process, you'll see that they actually do have a very strong, formal decision-making process that they've been continuing throughout. Now, that being said, they don't have, like I said, elected leaders, and they don't have specific representatives that they would say represent the movement, but they do have a sort of process that's creating sort of organic leadership among them.
I thought it was interesting that I read 70% of the people that are attending these events are employed. And this is in stark contrast to the publicity stunt that was pulled in New York, where the guy, I believe, dropped applications for like McDonald's jobs. Do you think average Americans get that as a takeaway, or is this idea that like these are young kids who are unemployed just hanging out with tents?
Right. I mean, that's actually a really good point, and that that's one of the people who are trying to malign this movement are saying, go get a job, so on and so forth. By the way, there's about 4 unemployed Americans for every job opening, so it's not as easy as go get a job. But that is one of the points, and a lot of the people that I met that are going to the demonstrations, actually, they may be employed part-time, so that they want to spend, let's say, 3 days out of a week there, at the protest, and spend the rest of the days working and that sort of thing. And I actually think it's really positive, because I don't think it should just be unemployed people out there doing these demonstrations. It should be everyone in solidarity. So
I was listening to an interview with Todd Gitlin, the 60s activist, who said that one of the things that is so different with this movement than what they experienced, whether it was Vietnam or civil rights, is that this movement was basically popular from the beginning. Given that, what do you think happens moving forward?
It's very difficult to say. I mean, when any movement happens, it can flower, or it can completely collapse, and it's very, very difficult to predict. What I would say about this movement, I think Gitlin's observation is very astute, because almost as soon as it started, it broke into the mainstream media. It had a wide base of support, and it's been going on for months in a way that movements typically in America don't.
Thank you so much. I completely have to cut you off. That's all the time that we have today. I hope we're able to have him back on to talk more about this. Follow us on Twitter at AAIUSA, or log on to our website at aaiusa.org. Thanks so much for watching.